Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Hello and welcome to Home Education Matters, and today we are doing an episode on revision tips. So Iram and I are going to be talking you through our top tips. Well, actually Iram mainly, because I don't have that many top tips for exam revision. So Iram is going to be talking us through her top tips for exam revision, and it's very much the time of year when many of us have finished the content with the children, or the children have finished their exam content, and now it is revision time. And I've done a podcast recently on using exam papers to help with revision, and I thought that today we would have a more general tips for revision session. So Iram, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today, and do tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for having me on, Eleanor. It's lovely to see you again and chat with you about this. And so, I thought I'd tell everybody a little bit, just to give them a bit of a background and some context, really. So I've been home educating for nearly 18 years now, so it's quite shocking to discover that the other day. And I have always home educated. So I've got 3 children. The older 2 have graduated home education some years ago. My eldest is in her final year at university this year, and my middle daughter, who is in her second year of A-levels, was home educated up to GCSE. My oldest, we went through to A-level. And I have a 12-year-old who's still home educated as well and has always been. So she's sort of just started with her GCSEs and IGCSEs. So that's a bit about me. And we studied mainly for all our subjects just ourselves with the textbook and online resources. So we didn't outsource to tutors or online schools, although of course there's nothing wrong with that option if that's what works for you as well. And I kind of very much of the opinion that you have to find, there's a bit of trial and error involved as well, and you have to find what works for you and experiment sometimes as well. So we covered both. My older 2 did 8 GCSEs each, the sciences, English language, geography, environmental management, and classical civilizations, maths obviously. And so we covered a broad range of subjects and just did it ourselves independently. So my background, so as well as being a home educator, I'm a qualified teacher many years ago, qualified, and I'm an online tutor as well, so I teach English online. So that's my background. And so I thought we'd cover sort of a wide issues relating to exam preparation and revision. So kind of the first part I thought we'd look at is sort of planning for exams. So in the initial sort of stages, how to go about planning in terms of your timetables and so on, and look advice in terms of how to get an overview of what needs covering. Then some practical strategies and advice in terms of maximizing your time and revising effectively. I want to touch on decoding exam questions and understanding command words. And then some practical advice in terms of exam technique and time management. And then finally, sort of some advice on preparing for the day itself and some sort of general advice around that. So that's sort of a plan for what I hope to cover in this session with you. So should I just get started with that, or do you have any questions?
Absolutely. No, that sounds excellent. And for those of you listening who may recognize Iram's voice, Iram did a podcast with us on guiding us through the exam process. So this is how to choose your subjects, how to book your subjects, deciding on your different specifications and what exam board you're going to use. And that was one of our first ever episodes, and was still one of our most popular episodes. And also Iram has joined us for a Cambridge English language IGCSE specific episode, which was probably our most jam-packed content episode, where you really talked us through absolutely everything you could ever want to know about the Cambridge English Language IGCSE. So that was just in case any of our listeners were sitting there thinking, I know this woman's voice. Yes, I recognize this voice. So, okay, Iram, that sounds perfect. So start us with your first topic there, which I think was planning. Was it planning for exams?
Yeah, it's getting started really, sort of in the initial stages of revision, I think the first thing to kind of mention really is the tendency that we all have of sort of wanting to put off, and what we're kind of a bit apprehensive about. Obviously, uh, exams can be daunting, both for students and for parents, and so there's, procrastination, I think, is one of your enemies here. So you don't want to sort of put off the sitting down and kind of working what you need to do and the time scale that you need to cover that in. So don't procrastinate is in essence what I'm here, because it's not going to get any easier by delaying it or putting it off. And I think part of the process of building your confidence and exam readiness is actually feeling like you're more in control of the situation. And for me, always with my kids, the first part of that is devising a revision schedule, a timetable, understanding how much you need to cover, what you need to cover over what time scale, building in plenty of time for past paper practice in the last weeks running up to the exam. And that's a really, really valuable part of your exam and revision strategy. Certainly was for us, and I'd strongly recommend that, because I'll be talking a bit more about past papers later on, but that's a hugely valuable experience and an opportunity to really understand and get down to the nuts and bolts of what's required in the exam. So the tip here is to devise a plan, a revision schedule, a timetable, call it what you will, with a degree of flexibility, but with a kind of time frame for what you need to cover over what time scale, breaking down the syllabus into manageable chunks. And part of this also is knowing yourself, knowing what is realistic for you and what you can cover in how much time, and adjusting your time scales and your revision schedule accordingly. And linked to that is being aware of and sort of making sure that you're looking at revision in terms of short burst chunks of time. Ideally, I mean, experts say you don't want to be studying or revising something for longer than about 20 minutes at a time, just because after that point, your concentration starts to wane and you'll find you're not kind of engaging with the material productively after that point. So short bursts, little and often is the key here. And not just thinking about in terms of the quantity, quality, how efficiently and effectively you're covering the material.
So would the theory there be that you would do 20 minutes of revision and
Yeah.
then maybe like have a 5-minute break and then do another 20 minutes? Or are you talking 20 minutes and then another 20 minutes in the afternoon?
No, I think, again, this comes back to what's workable for you. And it may take some trial and error as well. But I think the first option is generally what I'd recommend. So 20 minutes, short break, 20 minutes short break, and pace yourself across the day. So you're covering within your time scale, your timetable that you've devised, you're covering, say, a module, a chunk of a topic that you've allocated that day for across the day, spread out in short bursts. So I hope that makes sense. So kind of thinking about how to maximize your time, and not just, I mean, if you're sitting there looking at a book for hours on end, a point will come when it's not really going in anymore and you're not engaging with it and you're glazing over. So it's not just about sitting there in terms of number of hours constantly, continuously. It's about whether it's actually going in, whether you're using that time efficiently and effectively. And a part of this also, I think, is knowing, again, it comes back to knowing yourself, removing distractions. So if you know you're distracted by notifications on your phone or your iPad being nearby or WhatsApp messages or whatever, remove those distractions. So part of it is, I think, knowing that that is a distraction for you and then taking steps to remove those distractions. Similarly with music, for some people, music, classical music for concentration, you can find playlists for that. That sort of thing can be conducive to concentration, but equally, if you're listening to pop music with lyrics and singing along, unlikely to be the most effective strategy there. So knowing what is a distracting influence on you and removing those so that you're able to focus meaningfully on the task at hand and really making the most of that time, so that you can, and I think, me personally, checklists, so you've got your timetable and you've got your checklist. There's something very satisfying about ticking things off for me. And that makes you feel like you've achieved your goal for that day or that morning or whatever it is. So that is something that I think can help you. And it's incremental, isn't it? So you're doing little bits at a time, but over time it's building up and you're covering the syllabus, effectively working towards your end goal. So yeah, that's my first sort of tips about sort of the process of getting started, and just get stuck in. I think that's the biggest thing. Just sort of devise that schedule, work out what you want to cover, over what time scale, break it down in manageable chunks, short bursts, really maximizing your time and using that time efficiently and effectively, removing distractions. So that's a bit about that. Moving on from that, I think there is no substitute for really understanding what is covered in the syllabus. So I think for me personally, when we worked on things with my daughters, we go back to basics. So you look at the syllabus is on the board website. We read the textbook, the resources you have, the note cards you may have made while you were sort of going through your textbook. So reviewing the syllabus, making sure that you're clear on what topics are covered in the syllabus, what the course content is. Be strong on that, because it's really important to remember that they can't test you on anything that isn't on the syllabus. I know that sounds obvious and it's a given, but I think it's important to remind ourselves of that fact, because if we go back to syllabus and we make sure we're solid on all the topics, there are literally going to be no holes in any of our knowledge that can kind of erode our confidence, I think, as well. So a lot of that is a confidence building thing as well. And there's no substitute for that. So going back to the syllabus, and with my daughters, we always used to cover the textbook in manageable chunks from September to about February-ish. And then what we do is we do a kind of speed through the textbook again, reviewing everything that we've covered in the last few months, reviewing our resources, notes, note cards. My daughters always used to make notes whenever we covered a topic, make flashcards on case studies, for example, for geography or formulae for physics or whatever it was. And then reviewing that, especially valuable is reviewing the stuff for your own notes. And so thinking about that, there are only so many possible questions that they can ask you on a topic. There are only so many sort of possible permutations. So if you cover, as depending on what boards you're studying, and there are more papers available for some specifications than others, past papers, for some subjects, especially Cambridge subjects, there's a huge wealth of past papers. So if you just go through papers, you will have covered all the topics and covered virtually all of the possible ways in which certain topics are covered and the questions that are posed on that topic are presented to you. So that's important to remember, because if you've just done enough of that, chances are there's very little that they could ask you that would throw you, because you've probably covered it in some way, shape or form already in all your past paper practice. And another thing I think is to think about knowing yourself. So what areas do you find you particularly struggle with? What areas are particularly challenging for you? Maybe there are some dry topics found quite hard going, heavy going when you went through them the first time. So find strategies for addressing, identifying and tackling those weak areas. So one effective strategy for this is talking it through. So just describing or explaining what you've learned to somebody, a lay person who doesn't know the syllabus. So you're presenting it in a way that they understand it, then it shows and it reinforces your own knowledge and understanding. And it makes it less sort of arduous. Another strategy, and my eldest daughter did this for a couple of her GCSEs, is she paired up with a friend who lived quite a distance from her, so it wasn't in person, it was online, and she just used to have these study buddy sessions where they used to kind of quiz each other. They'd decide a topic that they were going to look at in the next session. They'd have a Zoom call and then they'd kind of quiz each other and test each other on having that sort of accountability. Meant that they were both sort of more on it and sort of focused on making sure that they did cover that topic. There's also, and I think this is really important for students who are maybe audiovisual learners, there's a wealth of resources online, and YouTube is your friend. You know, over the years I've made up many YouTube playlists for every subject that we covered. So there are past paper walkthroughs and podcasts, and there are resources like that. And another thing is you can also create your own recordings, like on Zoom, or record audio recordings. Something I used to do back in the day when cassette tape, I used to write my own notes, and then you can listen to it on the go, like if you're on the tube or if you're on the bus, or and there's something I always thought in subliminal learning there as well, sort of you're absorbing it without realizing it in a kind of unconscious, if it's playing in the background while you're doing the housework or whatever, tidying your room. So I think it's kind of mixing up the styles as well. So not just sitting there with your textbook in front of you endlessly day after day, because that can get very, very exhausting, I think, and kind of a bit dull and repetitive. So mixing up with audiovisual things there's so many out there to choose from. Sometimes you kind of think there's just so much, it's overwhelming in terms of knowing which ones to select, but try out different things and look for recommendations as well. Another thing in terms of covering the topics is, I always thought that it's a good idea to mix up the order in which you approach the topic. So not necessarily going from front of the book to the back of the book, front cover to the end, because I don't know about other people, but for us, when we started in September, refreshed after summer break, often you're full of enthusiasm and you're sort of tackling it and you're eager. And then sort of around the middle of the year, you kind of have this sort of not I wouldn't say nosedive, but you have a little slump, I think, where you're starting to fag a little bit. And there's quite often we found that the topics that we covered in the middle of the year were the ones maybe that we were a bit hazy on. And also because you sort of start from the beginning and go through the textbook again and again, you get stronger reinforcing the knowledge that you covered with. And the middle area of the textbook sort of gets a little bit fuzzy. So start with the middle of the text in your revision, not just sort of going back from the beginning and working your way through. So mixing up the order in terms of how you approach topics. And as I said, like allowing and building in plenty of time for past paper practice, which will help you hone your exam technique. So it will help you weed out any areas that you need to focus on and identify those weak areas, and then think about strategies to tackle those. So yeah, instead of I think there's a natural tendency for us to want to avoid things that we find difficult or challenging. And I think that's not helpful in this context, because you want to tackle head on those issues that are problematic for you or that are challenging. And that way you build your confidence rather than sort of trying to avoid it. And then, you've got this sort of doubt in the back of your mind, that what if that question comes up, and that's not good for your confidence either. So I think a lot of it is that build your confidence, your knowledge of the subject, having a sound knowledge of the subject and feeling like you're on top of it in terms of your timescale really does help to build confidence. And that's a big part of it, I think. And so moving in terms of past papers. So yeah, in the last few weeks, we'd kind of aimed to run through the textbook again with that second reading between over about 2 weeks, typically, I think, sort of February-ish time. And then we would just devote sort of March onwards to past paper practice, and obviously revisiting trickier topics that, when you're doing past papers, it becomes apparent which areas you're struggling on, which areas you're not scoring highly on in terms of marks. So you go and revisit. So it's an ongoing process. You're kind of going and filling in any gaps that emerge. And so in that last phase of about a month, 5-6 weeks maximum, I'd say, of past paper practice, with my daughters, typically we did a paper a day. And if that's daunting, you don't have to start with a paper a day. You can build up to that from, using sort of mini mocks, focusing on a particular topic. So I did that for geography, for example. I'd collected together past paper questions on specific topics. Did that for environmental management with my daughter, and she did it last year as well, the youngest one. So collecting together past paper questions on specific topics. You could also, another option is to start with an open book approach to exam papers. So do the exam paper with the book alongside, so you can refer back to it if you find your mind is a bit blank on certain topics. And in the process of doing that, you should be filling in those gaps. And the key here is sort of replicating or simulating the exam process as much as possible as you get closer to the exam. So trying to create the conditions, and so you get used to that. So you're not phased by it when you're on the actual day of the exam. So building up from the open book approach, or looking at mini mocks, focusing on specific topics, if that's, if doing a whole paper is too overwhelming, to the point where you are doing a complete paper within the specified time frame, one a day, and then using past paper mark schemes associated with those past papers and the examiner's reports to really identify what exactly examiners are looking for. Understanding mark schemes is a really important aspect of revision strategy. So I always think of it as like playing a game, taking exams. So if you don't know the rules of the game, you can't score the points, and the rules of the game are in the mark scheme. That's what examiners are using to assess students' responses. So understanding what they're looking for naturally helps you tailor your responses to what they're looking for. And a lot of that, as part of that, is understanding subject-specific terminology. There's a huge difference between having strong knowledge on a subject and tailoring it to the demands of exam questions, which I think sometimes people neglect. They don't focus on that as much as they should do. And then consequently, even if they have a good knowledge of the subject, unfortunately, they're not doing themselves justice in an exam situation, not tailoring it exactly to the requirements of the question or what examiners are looking for.
I think that's really true, because you've been talking about, the importance of planning your revision and making sure that you're covering the content and the topics from the syllabus. And I think this idea that you also have to know your stuff, but also know how to present it in the exam is so important, isn't it? Because I know that we actually did a podcast. I did a podcast with Chaitana Greenwood about exam hacks, and this was all about basically understanding what this word means in this syllabus.
Yeah.
What does explain mean here? What does describe mean here? And it's the kind of thing that easily can push you up a grade, just being really clear about what the exam, because the different exams mean different things for describe and for explain. It's very frustrating. You can't always assume they're going to mean the same thing. So I'm guessing that's what you mean when you're talking about subject specific terminology.
Yes, but also things like the difference between amount and volume, for example, in the sciences. They're expecting you to use specific terminology, which most of the syllabus, when you look at the syllabuses online, they'll often have a glossary. Textbooks often have a glossary or keywords defined, and you can find them online as well. So kind of really understanding. There are a lot of easy quote unquote low-hanging fruit marks available for questions which just ask for definition. So really understanding terminology is crucial to that. But also, as you say, and I'm going to speak briefly about the importance of understanding command words as well, as part of decoding what a question is asking of you, which I think a lot of the time students, in their rush to get writing, don't properly understand what they're being asked to produce and what the exam question is asking of them. And that's really important, because if you haven't got the focus right, even if your answer is brilliant, you're not going to be, they haven't got grounds to award you the marks because you're missing the mark, literally. So that's kind of thinking about using past papers. You want to aim to write your paper within the specified time, because obviously that's what you're building up to. Initially, you may find that that's a struggle, but with time, and this is where I think practice really does bring improvement, because with that you build your strength, your stamina, physically as well as anything else. Handwriting for 2 hours is we may think handwriting papers is anachronistic and in an age of email and online communication, but exams are still handwritten. So building up that physical stamina, but also the mental stamina to cope with that, is a part of the past paper practice experience as well, building that up over time so that, it's all valuable in terms of building your confidence. So on the day, you almost, I think once you get to a certain point, you almost go into autopilot, I think, on the day of the exam, when you've done so many, you almost anticipate a lot of the questions that are going to come up. Certainly some of the topics that are regularly appear on past papers, you kind of expect and anticipate certain questions, and you're less likely to be phased. And remember also that you're not aiming for 100%, even for a top grade. So you don't have to score absolutely 100% on each question, which I think you sometimes people lose sight of that as well. So, yeah, on the topic of past papers, for some boards, I mentioned that there are fewer papers available than for others. So for Cambridge, for a lot of the subjects, there's a ton of past papers available because they have several sittings a year, and they have variants for each sitting because of the different time zones the papers are taken in, so that they don't, it kind of reduces or eliminates the possibility of people cheating or leaking the paper to people in other time zones. So that means that all those past papers are there, 3 variants for each sitting, which are all additional opportunities for you to practice. And so that I think is really, really important. For certain subjects, for edXam in particular, when they had a big revamp of a lot of their GCSEs and IGCSEs a few years ago, they changed the syllabus. So there's effectively a new syllabus in place for a lot of subjects. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that old spec papers aren't of any use, because quite often the core topics haven't changed that fundamentally. They've tweaked it in a lot of cases. And quite often, just to mention, you can find mapping documents on Edexcel's website, which kind of highlight points of similarity, you can compare. So just to give you an anecdotal example of that. So my middle daughter both my older daughters sat the Edexcel IGCSE biology exam. And then, my middle daughter, she sat the new spec one. I got the new textbook and there was virtually no difference. There were sort of small bits here and there which were different, and they just tweaked it. So the old paper, really valuable for practice, but we just had to be aware of where things might be slightly different. So that's just a note on past papers in terms of if there are fewer past papers available for the Edexcel IGCSEs in particular, there's still value in old papers, just so long as you're aware of where things have been changed a bit.
The other thing I've noticed is that my daughter's doing AQA history this summer, and you would think that there would be like loads and loads of past papers for AQA GCSE because it's the one that most schools do. But unfortunately, AQA seem to have massive copyright issues with their images that they use for their source material. So invariably, all of the past papers actually don't have the source material that you need for the paper. And similarly, my son, who's doing A-level marine science, that had a huge spec change about 3 years ago, and we're doing exactly what you say, which is we're still doing the older papers, but we're doing them for the content, less for actually understanding the exam. And one thing I would say when it comes to history, for example, the history paper issue that we're having is that if you've been studying alongside your child, or if you've been helping them with their work, it's more than possible that you can actually almost make up your own questions. That's what I quite often do. You get a sense of the sort of things they ask, and there's lots and lots of sources online that are available for all these different topics. And so it's easy enough to find a couple of different sources and then write your own questions as well. It's hard work, and it's not as easy as getting the past paper, but if you really find yourself stuck, you can do that. And also, of course, TES resources, they and Teachers Pay Teachers, they quite often have teachers that have made up kind of their own exam papers, just in case you're struggling to find any.
Yeah, for sure. I think actually making up your own questions is actually a way of testing your own knowledge also of the subject. So it has a benefit in that sense too, because you're helping solidify and consolidate what you've covered, and really sort of getting your head around what it is that they typically ask for, and how they there's often questions for geography A-level when my oldest daughter is doing it, which require you to sort of evaluate a statement sort of discuss a statement. Typically, they'd present you with a statement and you have to discuss it, which essentially means looking at arguments for and against and kind of weighing up the evidence and coming to some sort of conclusion. And so that is a really good way of really knowing the subject, really knowing the topics, because in order to come up with a question, you have to think about what it is you would be answering, what it would be that you'd present as your evidence and what line of argument you'd take. So I think that has a benefit in that sense as well. So I think that's really good advice. Yeah, and so I wanted to talk a little bit. I know you mentioned a bit about command words, and as I said earlier, I think so important to be able to decode the exam question, because I think a lot of the time students neglect it, and it's very easily done. I tell a lot of my students this, especially the ones that preparing for exams, that it's so important to kind of read and understand the question. It sounds obvious, and I say this to my students all the time. I know it sounds like like that's a given, right? But you'd be surprised how many students don't understand what they're being asked, and in an exam context, when the pressure is on to get writing, and start putting down things on paper, it's very easy to just sort of scan the question and not really break it down in terms of really understanding what's required. So advice that I give all my students and my daughters as well was to read and understand the question. Read it more than once, especially if it's a longer answer that they're looking for and it's sort of a mini essay type question. Read it carefully and understand it, highlighting, circling, or underlining the key words. And I always think it's a good approach to kind of step back from that and ask yourself, what does this mean? What does this word mean? What does this, paraphrasing that effectively. And so you've really got your head around what it is the examiner is asking of you. Understanding those command words is really important. Using highlighters, which I'm often asked, are you allowed to use highlighters? Yes, you are. Is really helpful for yourself in terms of identifying those key terms. And so in terms of command words, I think of it in terms of levels. So level 1 is sort of the straightforward identify, give, state, define, really basic knowledge testing questions. So define this term, or identify, or state, or give. Level 2 is describe or explain. So that's kind of identifying the what and the why. And level 3, which are the questions which carry the highest marks, are those, like the example I gave you of my daughter's A-level geography, where you have to discuss and evaluate, which really kind of are the most demanding and rightly carry the greatest number of marks. And so for that, you really need to kind of weigh up and consider different perspectives or explanations, the validity of different viewpoints, and within that, drawing on what you know about the subject and applying that knowledge sometimes to novel situations. Like quite often for the sciences, they'll talk about there'll be questions on there which you won't have technically covered that particular scenario or that particular study or whatever that's referenced in the exam. What they're looking for is for you to apply what you know to that novel, unfamiliar situation or scenario. And that's crucial. So, and that can throw students sometimes, because they kind of think, well, I haven't covered this study or this, this in research. But the point is, you have the knowledge. You need to think about what knowledge applies to this situation, this scenario, and how does that make sense of it? How do I make this meaningful? So that's some advice on sort of understanding those command words. And those command words are all, and all the boards. I did a quick search actually before we started this call, and there's the BBC Bytes has if you just put the board like Edexcel, IGCSE, or whatever command words, it will come up with a glossary of the terms. So it's worth taking some time to just understand what the difference is between explain, justify, compare, contrast. So compare and contrast are quite often used in exam questions as well. That's kind of comparing means sort of asking yourself, what are the similarities or differences between these two, whatever it is you're comparing, approaches. Contrasting is like, well, if you think about what contrast means, it's a difference, isn't it? So thinking about identifying and commenting on quite often those differences. So kind of really taking time to think about what those different command words mean, so that when you're faced with a question using these different command words, You know exactly what's required. So to analyze again is to examine in detail, to show the meaning of something, or to identify elements and relationships between them, or kind of looking at it in terms of the specifics of the question, but understanding what those command words mean in that context. So I would recommend spending time, taking time to really understand that. And so I wanted to move on next to talk about time management and exam strategy, which is something I talk quite a lot about with students, particularly for the syllabus I teach, the Cambridge IGCSE English Language, and I think this is something worth mentioning. You don't have to attempt the questions in the order that they're presented in. So you don't have to work from front to back of the paper in the order in which the questions are presented, because quite often the questions which carry the most marks are at the end of the paper. And that might be something that's worth thinking about in terms of how and when you decide to approach that. Because if you're coming towards the end of a 2-hour paper and there's a question which carries the most marks at the end, and you're running out of time, maybe your hand's starting to get tired, your energy, is starting to flag, maybe it's worth considering attempting that question earlier, not necessarily as the first question, but starting somewhere in the middle, maybe, so you have a bit of a, warm up, if you like, before you get into the chunkiest question. And so the advice here really is to think about experiment with different approaches now, sort of while you've got the time in the run up to the exam, and work out what works for you. Think about how you manage your time as well. How much time you're going to devote to each of those questions. And the rough rule of thumb, generally, for most subjects, is spending a minute on a question that's worth 1 mark. So a mark a minute is your general sort of rule of thumb. However, this will vary. So for the English syllabus that I teach, there is reading time built into that. So, and also time you want to set aside for proofreading your responses as well, especially for English. So you're honing out any grammatical inconsistencies or mistakes with spelling, or just checking for sense as well, that there's nothing that sort of glaringly doesn't make sense there. So being mindful of how you allocate your time to different questions is the key here, and that will vary for different subjects. But thinking about your strategy, when it comes to those longer questions, thinking about how you're going to approach them. So devising a brief plan for longer responses. And I always say this to students, because there's a kind of, some students sort of proudly announce, almost like a badge of honor, that I don't plan anything, I just write it as I go along. And to be honest, having marked lots and lots of past papers, you can always tell the responses that are planned and thought through. They're just more polished, and they're presented in a more logical, coherent order. Like a lot of the time when students haven't planned, it shows, because the writing feels a bit disjointed. They're mentioning A, then they talk about B, then they go back to A, and it sort of doesn't flow as well. So again, I know, and I'm aware of the fact that, I'm conscious of the fact that students have this pressure on them to get writing, but a lot of the time for longer responses, mini essay type questions, or questions where you're being asked to explore or discuss something, having a brief outline, a plan, helps you, because it helps you organize your thoughts and your ideas, and it gives you a roadmap which allows for a degree of flexibility, but I always think of it as like, if you were going somewhere for the first time, you'd look up the route on maps or whatever, and you'd work out where you were going, where you're starting from, what your destination is, and how you're getting there. So I think of it as a roadmap, helping you get to your destination, which
I think it's kind of psychologically relaxing as well, isn't it? When you've got just a few little bullet points at the top of the page, it's almost like your brain can just settle down a little bit and think, okay, I don't have to remember, alongside all the other things I have to remember, I don't have to remember the structure of what I'm writing.
Yes, you don't have to hold that in your mind constantly. And also, you can refer back to it to check you're on track and you're not deviating or going off on a tangent. So you can go back to it and think, oh, what was it going to write about in the middle? Oh, yes, I refer back to my plan. And then obviously there's a degree of flexibility. So some new ideas might come to you while you're writing, which you can then build in as appropriate. But you've got a framework, a sort of template an outline, and that's helpful in terms of your own confidence as well. I think, as you say, it sort of helps you feel like you've got a handle on this. And I think we shouldn't underestimate sitting exams, especially first exams. You said it's daunting. So the more you can do to help yourself build your confidence and feel like you're in control of the situation, the better. And practicing applying your knowledge also. I mentioned, the subject specific terminology, volume versus amount. Another one for biology is oxygen versus air. Students, if you use the word air, you won't get the mark because they're looking for the word oxygen, not breathing in air, you're breathing in oxygen because that's biologically looking for there. So it's being aware of that kind of thing. Attention to the mark allocation is don't spend unnecessarily long amounts on questions which carry few marks, thereby giving yourself less time for questions which carry more marks, if that makes sense. So kind of thinking about pacing yourself, and again practicing is helpful there.
I think that tends to happen because the lower mark questions are at the start of the exam paper when everyone first sits down and they're super enthusiastic. And so quite often my daughter, for example, for like 2 mark questions, she will write lots. And I'm like, no, get in about an hour and a half, you're going to really regret that because you're going to cut down on your time, but also your energy and your enthusiasm. It's you're using up your energy a bit early, aren't you?
Yeah, it starts to flag. I think that's absolutely right. I think there's a tendency to want to kind of perform to your best, obviously, at the beginning, and then you kind of have you're writing. I've seen students write unnecessarily long answers, for example, for something that's just a 1 marker where they just need to write one word, even, or just a very simple short sentence, and you don't need to be because you're not going to get any more marks for that. They just want the key information. That's where understanding from the mark schemes and so on comes in, what's required. And just writing, what you're aiming to do really is write as little as possible, nailing as many marks and points as possible, writing as succinctly as possible, but having it you can get all the marks just from writing one sentence sometimes, as opposed to writing a paragraph where you're covering the same things but it's unnecessarily wordy and goes into unnecessary detail. And this comes back to the command word. So if you're just asked to describe, don't bother explaining. If you're asked to just state, you don't need to describe, you just need to state. So it's that kind of thing that comes back to kind of understanding what the question is asking of you.
I think in some ways, the opposite is also sometimes true with the longer questions, which is things like, for things like history or the humanities, English, that kind of thing. When it comes to sort of like 10-mark questions, the temptation sometimes is for students to pack too much into one sentence, when realistically you're really wanting a paragraph a point almost, aren't you, for those longer ones?
Yeah, and that's where I think examiners' reports come in really, really handy there, because I always think of examiners' reports as almost like a kind of guide to do's and don'ts. Because what the examiners do is they sit down or having reviewed every candidate's response, in that sitting, they gather together the observations of examiners in this report, and it basically highlights what they found students struggled with, what the typical mistakes that students made, things that were done well. And so it's really, really instructive to kind of read through that and understand what the common pitfalls are and the issues are so that you avoid them and you're kind of wise and alert to that. And yeah, sort of thinking about, really kind of understanding what it is that examiners are looking for and the common mistakes that students make, or how they kind of don't always nail it and why. And I think initially, and I think it's worth mentioning this. So it's a process. Revision and exam practice papers it's a process. So don't be discouraged if in those early stages when you're doing your first couple of papers, don't be disheartened if you get sort of a D or a C or whatever, because with practice you can expect to improve by up to 2 grades a lot of the time. It's quite common for students to go up by an average of 2 grades from the point when they're starting papers and the exams themselves. And I think often students are really hard on themselves. They kind of think, on my first paper I need to be scoring that A or scoring that C or whatever it is. And to be honest, I think you have to kind of take from it, and it's incremental. So every time you sit a paper and there are areas which you've identified which are weaker, or something, a command word you didn't quite nail, then you learn from that. And then the next time something comes up like that, you can apply that experience, the knowledge you've gained from that previous experience to that new situation, and then you'll be sort of in a stronger position. So I think that's really important. And I think in the early days and with past papers, it is a bit of a slog because you can pore over the mark schemes and the examiner's reports. But I think it's important to recognize that it gets faster with practice and self-marking papers. So I used to sit with my daughters and mark them with my daughters so that we could discuss and see what hadn't gone quite right or what was missing or what topics we need to go back and revisit. And that was really helpful in terms of getting to grips with and developing understanding of what examiners are looking for. And also remembering looking at the grade boundaries as well, because some people don't realize that the grade boundaries for some papers, especially for English and Maths, are not as high as you might expect. So kind of being aware of for depending on what grade you're aiming for, what the typical boundary is for that to what kind of marks you need to be scoring across both papers to average that, so you can aim for that. So that sort of all that information is out there and it's really helpful, I think. In terms of I wanted to talk a little bit about resources, tips and tricks next. So wanting to kind of go through some of the things that worked for us, some of the things that I know have worked for other students. And one of the things that I always thought was really valuable with my daughters, we did a lot of conversational learning. So a lot of it was we'd be on the bus or the tube and talking about a topic. And it's really, really, it goes back to what I was saying about my daughter with her study buddy friend, talking about or explaining what you've learned to somebody else is really valuable because you can't really explain a topic unless you understand it fully yourself. Also things like getting someone to test you, like on terminology or topics, that sort of thing really does help you test your own knowledge and reinforce what you know. And alongside that, so another resource that we've always found helpful, we used particularly for maths, which was we did that again as we did with all our other subjects, sort of the textbook and YouTube and resources online. But my background is in English, not maths. So it was one I was a little bit more apprehensive about, let's just say that. I did do quite well at maths, but I didn't take it to A level or anything. So I found past paper walkthroughs a really, really valuable resource, really incredible, because it talks you, especially for something like maths, you can see how you get from the question to the answer in steps with someone explaining it, and it makes so much more sense.
And
so that was
these walkthroughs are pretty much found on YouTube, aren't they? These
yeah,
exam
yeah,
walkthroughs.
yeah, and they're typically done by teachers and examiners, and so they're really, really valuable. I think sometimes even more valuable than having a tutor, because it just helps you hone in on and gives you, literally walks you through the whole process from, each question, how you get to the answer. So that was very, very helpful, especially
And
for the topics we found trickiest.
I know when my son was doing astronomy GCSE and there weren't a lot of resources online, we found a physics channel, Physics with Keith, on YouTube, and he was doing astronomy paper walkthroughs, and it was so helpful because it was just this person sort of saying, when this kind of question comes up, they're looking for this kind of thing. And when when you're doing a subject where there's not a lot of resources online, or maybe you've just had the textbook, it's really nice to find these walkthroughs. And actually Cambridge in particular, in the UK, there's not a lot of resources for Cambridge IGCSEs, but on YouTube, there's a lot of stuff because, of course, it's much more global. And you'll find often on YouTube, you'll get these walkthroughs of really quite niche IGCSE papers.
Yeah, for sure. And we used lots of them for lots of different subjects. So we did a mixture of Cambridge and Edexcel, but you're right that for Cambridge, because it's not sat as widely within the UK, and it's more a global phenomenon. Cambridge is huge internationally, so there are a lot of teachers at international schools. A lot of I remember because India have their own sitting for some of their papers. I remember looking at Indian channels made by Indian content providers and content creators, walking through I think we did physics with Cambridge, and so it was really, really helpful because yeah, so it's useful to kind of bear that in mind. So kind of thinking a little bit more creatively maybe sometimes, and thinking along those lines about the benefit of gamifying things. So that's something that we used to do as well. So it can be on, on a very simple level, like kind of memory match type games, pairing up definitions with terms. Or there are online resources like Seneca and Kahoot, Cognito. Quizlet was something my oldest daughter found really, really useful because there are a wealth of Quizlet, uh, you know, there's a lot of content that students and teachers have created, but be wary that, because anybody can create a Quizlet set. So, just check that it's all correct and as it should be. But what she found really useful was creating her own, because that helped her in the process. It was time consuming, but creating her own Quizlet set was actually really helpful because she was reinforcing. It was a revision tool and exercise in itself to create them and then to use them as a resource to test herself.
I think
So
we found that exact thing. My daughter makes her own Quizlet revision cards, and just the process of making them means that she then remembers them. And I remember when my son was doing, I think it was chemistry, and he had to have all these equations memorized. He made all these flashcards because he's much more analog, so he made them all on bits of card. And then he said, "Oh, will you test me on the flashcards?" He knew them all just because he'd written them all out. And the process of making the flashcards meant they were almost redundant by the time we actually got to use them. But that's a
that's
bonus, right? Because
that's the point, isn't it? And so you've solidified your knowledge in the process of creating it. And so I think that sort of thing is really useful. And again, it comes back to that point I made earlier about mixing up your approach and not sort of slavishly just going through the textbook every day slog. It's a slog that way, but sort of using these alternative approaches to mix it up and keep it engaging.
And
And
also,
yeah,
you can obviously use this approach for, I think sometimes people think, oh, well, that's fine for like maths and science, where you're sort of saying, what is peristalsis? And and then they flip it over and there's like a one line answer. But actually, I find that it's also very helpful for all sorts of humanities subjects. We did
yes.
a lot of flashcards, which were things like, for example, for history, you have questions where it's things like which source is the most convincing, and for example, you don't talk about provenance, or you might talk about provenance but you don't talk about your own knowledge, or maybe you talk about your own knowledge but you don't talk about the content, etc., etc. And even just having that really firm awareness of what the question is asking for, which obviously cycles back a little bit to when you're talking about decoding the paper.
Yeah.
Even just flashcards on that, I think, are really helpful for humanities.
For sure, for sure. I think that's really valuable advice. And I think it comes back to what you were saying earlier about creating your own questions. So in that context, like you're kind of having to understand the kinds of questions that would be typically posed in order to create those flashcards for yourself to test yourself. So it's all sort of part of the same process. And sort of thinking about other audio visual sort of aids or tools that we used, diagrams and color coding and making posters, mind maps, that kind of thing it's for some students that's really valuable. So they kind of looking, sort of zooming out and getting the big picture and seeing how all the different topics fit together. And especially for A level, kind of forming synoptic links, so kind of knowing how certain topics might fit together and linkages between them. So that's quite helpful in terms of getting a kind of bird's eye perspective on everything. And simple things as well. It could be as simple as, like, I remember when we did physics, having post-it notes all over like parts of the house with formulae and key terms and things. And just so that, by that process of being exposed to it every time you go to the bathroom or whatever, you're seeing it there. Or like my middle daughter had them alongside her bed, I think. So she used to see them like every day. And then, you're just kind of it's sort of reinforcing and fixing it in your mind a lot of the time, because there is so much memorization involved with that. So a lot of subjects, isn't there?
I think for a lot of students as well, who are very visual learners, that kind of thing, like post-it notes with things up, is so valuable. And then for other students who may be more, I can't even remember the types of learning now, but where you need to write it down,
Yeah.
creating the flashcards. And I know that when I was younger, I think it was last summer, we had a lot of butterflies last summer, and I was looking at these butterflies, didn't have a clue what they were. And I remember I had a poster right by my head when I was in bed for about 7 years when I was a child of all of the British butterflies. I still don't know them because I'm not that kind. I don't
Yeah.
remember stuff from having it around me visually. But if I'd have written it down with a description, I would know to this day what butterflies they were. And it's about, I think one thing I'm really picking up on from our chat today is the importance of having all these different sorts of approaches, whether that is having all these different approaches to revision, having all these different approaches to when you do how you do exam papers, all these different approaches to, whether it's audio visual, whether it is writing it down, whether it's gamifying. And I think by doing that, not only does it create variety, but it allows you to expose your child to methods of learning that they will find helpful, as opposed to ones maybe that you find helpful or that you learned as a child.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I think what it comes back to is this idea that it's about knowing yourself, what works for you, and what works for you might not work for the next person, because we all have a very individual style of learning. And, there are knowing that there's a wealth of different ways in which to learn, and understanding those modes of learning is something that will stand you, in good stead, having that level of awareness, I think, going forward, not just for
And
this particular subject or exam that you're doing.
And I think that's the beauty of home ed. Sorry to go hark on again about how wonderful home ed is, which I feel like I
Yeah.
do every podcast, but it is a home ed podcast. But the fact that we are doing all this from home, I'm sure there are people listening who think, my God, this is a lot of work. It's a lot of work to do this. If they were in school, I wouldn't have to be doing any of this. But realistically, in school, they revise and they learn the way the teacher does. And now a good teacher will have all sorts of different approaches into a subject, but that's not always the case. And the beauty of doing it from home is that your child understands and learns how they learn, which is, like you say, a skill that they will take whether they go to university or not. Understanding how you learn is
Yeah.
is so vital, because it wasn't until I got into my 30s that I realized I learned from writing stuff down, because in a school we just did it the way we were told to do it. Now my
Yeah.
son, who is 17, he knows already that that's how he learns, because he's had this exposure through home education to being in charge of his learning journey.
Yeah, exactly. And it is a process, isn't it? So you try out different things and you work out what works and what doesn't work and what suits you. And so I know for myself, for example, that I writing things down, I will still write things down in preference if I'm trying to kind of in what's the word? If I'm trying to process, that's the word. If I'm trying to process information, especially if it's new information and maybe information heavy content, writing it down helps me engage actively with it and break it down in a meaningful way for me. And I'm sort of it's a kind of reciprocal process between me and what I'm reading, rather than just me sort of passively reading it and letting it wash over me. And then I get up to a saturation point where nothing more is going in.
And
So it's
that's absolutely what I find, because my daughter is a very much a visual learner. So, all these things you were talking about, flashcards and Quizlet and putting post-it notes up, that's how she learns. Now, she does Duolingo. In fact, the whole family do Duolingo, and we all have a different approach to Duolingo. She very much just sits down, she does a lesson a day, that's it. And it absorbs slowly over repetition and
yeah,
visualness. I have a notebook next to me, and every time a new word comes up, I'm like writing it down in my notebook.
yeah.
I don't rely on just the visual aspect. And this is all about these different routes into learning. And the more you understand how you learn, the more efficient you are at learning, which means that come exam time, you're more efficient at exam time.
Yeah, and I think it builds confidence as well, because then you know that it's not just you not being able to learn something, it's just the approach you need to take. You need to modify that according to what works for you, because if you're not the type of person who can read and memorize a textbook, no amount of sitting there and reading the textbook is going to help that knowledge seep into your brain and lock itself there. So you have to find the strategy that does work for you, and that, because it's incredibly demoralizing if you were to do that and then not be able to get that content etched in your brain. And then that has repercussions in terms of like your own confidence in yourself and your ability to learn. So being aware of that actually helps the process and builds your own confidence in your ability as well, which I think is so important. Continuing on that sort of topic, really, and thinking in terms of like, sometimes I think one of the biggest things is, certainly for A level, is just a huge volume of content. And so one of the things that I always like to do for myself is break it down and think of it a bit like, if you want to use an organic image, it would be something like a tree. So the trunk is like the body of knowledge, and then you've got within that subject specific sort of topics, which are your branches, and then they branch off further into these little twigs. So, or a kind of non-organic analogy would be like a computer analogy. So you've got your folders, and you've got your subdivided sort of folders within that. So basically, I think that helps you a bit like the sort of mind mapping across a whole subject, helps you see how everything fits together and gives you a sense of how it's interconnected. Especially where you have to kind of think across topics, which you do for a lot of the more discuss, evaluate, analyze type questions. We'll want to see you making those linkages between different areas of the syllabus.
I think that comes back to that one of the very first points you made about making a revision schedule and using the syllabus, is that as you were talking, I had this wonderful kind of image in my mind of a big poster where you write at the trunk of the tree, the roots, you write the subject, environmental management or whatever, and then you have all these different offshoots. And actually, if you have the textbook, or the syllabus, if you download it, it's actually very, very easy to do this, because most exams, they have something like 7 or 8 big topics. Then within that big topic, they'll have smaller topics. And if you were to create, for example, or your child was to create a big poster with those on, not only are they then making these patterns that you say are so important about understanding how topics link together, but it's also a means whereby they can maybe mark off, color it in when they've revised it, or whatever it is that motivates them.
Yeah, definitely. So it's kind of having at hand all those different strategies and tools. It's having a toolkit really of different strategies that you can apply, which work for you and which tried and tested will produce results and help you build your knowledge, reinforce it, and build your confidence in the process. So there's mind maps. And another thing is sort of we did psychology with my older two as well. And so kind of thinking about how you can sometimes create a story out of what you're learning. So you kind of visualize going on a story, or visualize images in your mind that link different ideas. And, thinking about context-based learning as well. So kind of imagining a scenario where this might happen, whatever it is you're looking at. There's the context-based learning, and thinking about how you can make it kind of relevant in some way, meaningful, therefore more likely to be retained in the memory. So things like that can be helpful. I guess that sort of is similar to kind of the use of mnemonics, like in some ways, so thinking about how Mrs. H. Gren might tell you about the life processes and things, and biology and things like that. Helps you with that subject specific terminology. Things like physics, using formula triangles, which is a really nice way of thinking about the relationship between different variables and things. And yeah, I just wanted to also say that in terms of just a general tip also is thinking about formula triangles and mathematical stuff. A lot of subjects will have an element, and I think a lot of students feel a bit intimidated by data interpretation, or any kind of mathsy type questions. I know things like environmental management and geography have those elements. Psychology has a third of the marks are on research methods, which include data interpretation and statistical things, aspects and tests. So that can be a bit intimidating if you're not a mathsy person, but don't throw away marks for that. Again, it's sort of, don't bury your head in the sand and try to ignore that because it's sort of challenging for you. But kind of try to confront that directly and get to grips with that in terms of simple skills and basic skills, which are also going to be relevant for maths and the sciences. Things like reading tables and pie charts and drawing graphs and knowing how to label your axes and how to plot points on the graph and everything else. So those sorts of things are useful for so many subjects, and not just maths, but the sciences, geography, environmental management, and psychology all have elements of those sort of data interpretation and analysis of pie charts and graphs and things. So it's something that it's worth investing some time and effort into sort of getting to grips with.
I think if I was going to have my time again, which Thankfully, I'm not going to. If I was going to have my time
You never
again, there are
know, never know.
maybe the grandchildren. There, there are two things that I would focus on, one sciencey and one humanities. And I would have focused on these much earlier, like around about 10, 11. And the first one is tables, graphs, because I think, like you say, that is so helpful for so many subjects all the way through. My son did a marine science A-level mock paper, and it was
Mm,
data handling.
yeah.
And he came to me afterwards and quite bereft. He said there were no graphs. There were no graphs. How can there be no graphs? Because he did statistics as his very first GCSE when he was 13, and that helped him so much because even his A-level maths now is still using the same kind of statistics that he learnt in his GCSE. And the second thing I would do is on a completely almost like the contrary side, I would do a lot more looking at nuance, what's under the surface of texts, what is not being said, what is being implied.
Implicit meanings, yeah.
Yeah, because I think in things like history and English, that kind of looking below the surface, I think they are probably the two core skills that I've seen most come up most often in GCSEs, all sorts of different subject GCSEs.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree with you. So the stuff that we did, like my eldest daughter who's reading psychology at university, the stuff that she did at GCSE level for maths and the sciences, as well as she did psychology as well, but even if she hadn't, I mean, with the data analysis, the statistical methods, there's a huge chunk of it at A level and the same sort of thing, but obviously developed and sort of built on at degree level. So there is, it follows through. So you're laying foundations really. And also I think in general, like, to be sort of um, able to understand data in society, like looking at, news reports and things, and being able to be, interpret graphs and charts and things is something that I think is a good skill in life generally, as is what you were talking about with implicit meaning. So being able to understand subtext, thinking about what's being suggested at or hinted at, and not necessarily that critical evaluation, being able to kind of analyze and pick apart things and understand. I always say this to my English students, like being able to understand how, advertising, for example, might be trying to influence our perceptions. That's what I think is so important as a skill, as just functioning in society, to be able to kind of know when we might be being manipulated and know when we kind of need to kind of think beyond just the superficial surface level of meaning, and to be able to dive into that sort of nuts, those subtleties and nuance there that are being suggested. So I'm a firm believer in that, and I think it's so important to encourage that mindset, that sort of critical mindset from a young age. So yeah, I totally agree with you on that.
And I
um
think actually, as humans, the
yeah.
ability to be able to understand statistics and data without having to rely on a third party translating it for us who may have their own biases, and also raising a new generation that are critically evaluating what they hear and how they're being influenced. I mean, without getting like super political, these are all good things, right, for
For
our new
sure.
generation.
For sure. I absolutely agree with that. And so that's always something that I've tried to foster with my kids, but also with my students, because it's not just about sitting, studying English as an exercise in itself to sit the exam and tick that box. It's about sort of what skills you take forward in terms of how you are functioning within society, and how you kind of examine, information which may be apparently sort of supposedly unbiased, but you're sort of, picking apart that for yourself. And as you say, not via a third party, being able to do that independently, is a really important skill, I think, and something that we need to foster. Especially in the social media age. I mean, we could go off and do a whole podcast on that, but I think it's so important to have that sort of awareness. That awareness is important. Yeah, and so that's kind of some tips there I had in general about sort of using this toolkit of different strategies that work, finding out what works for you and using a whole array of different, having them at your disposal really, and knowing what works for you. And then last of all, I think I had some practical advice in terms of, for the day itself, or is in advance of and on the day itself. So things like sort of, again, I think so much of the exam taking process is about building confidence. So knowing what to expect. So things like visiting the exam center in advance, knowing the route you're taking, testing out the journey, checking for delays, looking after yourself, on the day having breakfast, so you're fueled up for the 2 hours, and then maybe if you've got a long journey as well in advance and on the way back home, you've got enough energy to sustain you through that. Being clear on sort of admin things like checking on emails from your exam center and you're clear on the procedures and that you've been entered for the right subject and everything else well in advance. That you've been entered for the right syllabus and the right board and the right course code and everything. And on the day itself, check the paper, because it has been known to happen that people have been given the wrong paper. So don't just sort of trust in the system. Make sure that you're checking that and be aware, and encourage your child to put their hand up and not feel intimidated, hard as it is, about asking if they're unsure about anything.
We had a personal experience of that yesterday where
Oh,
I
really?
had printed off an exam paper for my daughter for history. I printed off her source paper and the exam paper, and then I had to go and work. And I set her off doing this exam paper. I came back an hour later and she was in tears at the dining table. And I said, well, what's going on? What's happened? And she said, doesn't make any sense. None of it makes any sense. And she said, they're asking me about the Berlin Wall and I haven't studied the Berlin Wall. And I had printed off the source paper for conflict and tension in Asia, and I'd printed off the exam paper for conflict and tension in the East and West, which are annoyingly similarly worded.
Yeah.
And so she was doing the sources for one paper and the exam paper for another.
Yeah.
And of course, none of it matched up. And after we had got over our initial hiccup, and I had apologized profusely for making that admin mistake, I did say what an amazing preparation that is, so that if you get into an exam, especially with things like history, where there's so many permutations and they're all very similarly worded. If you find yourself looking at a paper thinking this doesn't make any sense, or why am I answering a question on the Berlin Wall when I'm actually doing the Korean War, for example, you're able to sort of to have that bit in your brain that goes, let me just check the front of the paper again and just make sure they're matching up.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And similarly, I was thinking of, as you were saying that, for psychology, for instance, which my youngest daughter is planning on doing as one of her next couple of GCSEs, there are options. So as you say, similar for history, there are 4 different topics, I think it is, on paper 2, and you only have to do 2 of the I think it's actually 5, and you have to choose 2. So there'll be questions on topics you haven't covered. So being aware of that and knowing that you're not thrown. And there are some students who attempt questions which then they're not actually supposed to, because you only need to answer 2. Every year you'll find some students who've answered 3 or something. They've answered questions which they're not actually supposed to be answering, because that's not the options they've chosen. So being aware of that, knowing what the papers look like and familiarize, and then hopefully if you've done lots of past paper practice, you'll be familiar with that. And things like knowing how many papers and how much, being clear on how much time is allowed and what the weighting is, if there's an insert or if it's just one booklet, how many questions you need to answer, and you've selected the right answers, the right number, you're answering the right number of questions rather from the relevant sections. Be confident and know that if something doesn't seem right, you should be able, encourage your young people to sort of put their hand up, because mistakes can happen. Also things like simple practical things like the rules around things like no watches, like they have a no watches rule now, so you're not allowed to take you're not allowed to take analog watches in at all even now, because of smartwatches. Obviously that's posing a risk of cheating. So to cover that, to kind of address that, they've just put a complete blanket ban on watches of any kind, which is annoying. But following on from that, making sure that you can see the clock from where you're sitting is important, because if that's your only way of gauging what time it is and how much time you have left, make sure that from where you're sitting you can see it clearly. Things like water, taking in water with no labels on, just a clear plastic bottle or a flask. That's transparent. And so being aware of those rules.
I think as well, having an understanding of what the exam what the exam feeling is going to be like, what the exam environment is going to be like. For example, I remember when my son sat one of his first exams, he was surprised to find that people were coming and going. You know,
Yeah.
that students were joining a bit late, or that students would leave early. And quite often there'll be students leaving after an hour and a half, after 2 hours. And if you're sitting a 2.5 hour paper, you're going to have a lot of students leaving. And
Yeah.
and then you've got people with extra time who you'll be leaving and they'll still be staying. And it's just that understanding that people will be in the room who aren't sitting your exam paper. They're sitting
Yes.
a different exam paper with different timings.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because I think, being conscious of that is important, and knowing that and being prepared for that is important. Because one subject, when my oldest daughter sat classical civilizations, she was I think there were just a handful of them sitting it, but there were lots of other students sitting exams, and it was a gym hall environment, so they had different timings on the board for each of the subjects. So you need to know which one is your time. And so one of my daughter's friends, who was also sitting the paper, actually miscalculated and thought she had an extra 15 minutes when, and then they give you a warning, 5 minutes left, and she was caught out by that because she hadn't looked at the right timing on the board. And so things like that, knowing that there will be, as you say, people coming in and out and starting and finishing at different times, and listening out for time checks and keeping an eye on the clock, and checking you're on track with that.
I think also being prepared for challenges that might happen as well. I know with my son's English language paper, which was his weakest subject and the one he was most worried about, he had an upset tummy that morning. He
Oh,
had to stop and go to the toilet twice. Then the clock stopped working, and there were numerous things that happened during the paper. And I think sometimes it can be kind of helpful just to give them almost strategies to help them when that happens. Okay, deep breaths, calm down, refocus, take a minute. Those kind of things can also be helpful, because there will be things that come up that you just can't prepare
unforeseen,
for.
yeah, unforeseen circumstances and things that happen which are out of your control, but focusing on how you deal with that and how you cope with that is the thing, because obviously you can't control that external environment that you're in, but what you can do is focus on how you respond to those challenges and those difficulties if they arise. So yeah, I think that's really good advice. So just generally, I think thinking about that in terms of focusing on your health and well-being in more general terms is really important as well. So, you know, much as this is all focused, we've talked a lot about focusing on exam revision and so on, and there are lots of practical things you can do to help yourself through that process. Um, Equally, it's important to remind ourselves that exams aren't the be all and end all, and that there is life beyond exams. And, one day these exams will be a distant memory. So it's a stepping stone for many students. And believe it or not, I had a student last year who really struggled with English, and he really just needed to get the tick box to get onto his apprenticeship scheme. And his mum told me that he came out of the exam saying he enjoyed it. And for me, that was just fantastic, that he enjoyed it, and he did well enough to get onto his apprenticeship, which was all he needed. But
What
I think we can think about it in terms of like positively trying to, see what we can get out of the process in a positive way, rather than just sort of seeing it as all negative. I mean, maybe we can try to some extent to enjoy the process as much as possible.
what I've always said with my children is the subjects that they really enjoy. I've always said, this is your chance to showcase your knowledge and really enjoy it and have fun with it. And then the subjects that they don't enjoy, I tend to emphasize, this is the last time you'll ever have to do this.
Yeah,
You'll never have to write about physics again or whatever it is. And I think you're right. I think making it a positive thing, I always try to make it as low key as possible on the day, so they don't get stressed. And I try to make, like you said, about making sure you get there early, your route, planning everything so that you're as relaxed as possible,
yeah,
meaning they can be as relaxed as possible.
for sure. I think if you don't feel like you're in control of the situation, it just adds to the anxiety, doesn't it? And the stress levels soar. So if you can build in time for yourself to have a relaxed kind of start to the day, taking that bit of time to eat well, to generally looking after your health and nutrition, drinking water, resting when you need to. You mentioned breathing techniques. all those sorts of things in the run up to the exam. And that period of intense sort of stress for a lot of people, it is an intensely stressful experience. But understanding that it's not the be all and end all, and trying to focus on the positive. And as you say, for some subjects, if you enjoy it, it's your chance to show off. It's your chance to show off to the examiner and say, look, I know this stuff, and I'm proud of what I've done. And however things turn out, knowing that you've given it your best, that you can be proud of yourself for that. And that's something that's valuable in and of itself. And sort of thinking in general in terms about sort of knowing when to switch off is really important as well, like knowing when to take breaks. And that in itself helps to build and maintain motivation as well, I think, rather than sort of thinking like you need to be on this like 24/7, like your mind is constantly on exam. And I think that can be energy depleting over time and erode your motivation. So knowing when it's healthy to take those breaks, taking exercise and being in fresh air and nature, that sort of it's a healthy approach, I think, to the whole business of taking exams is very important. And yeah, so really that's about all I had to cover. I just wanted to kind of do a recap in terms of what we've covered. So just as a kind of checklist, I suppose, of bullet points of things that you can sort of take away, the key takeaways, if you like, from what we've discussed today. So, number one, reading the specification and the syllabus. And it's quite often the case that there's schemes of work, which I didn't mention earlier on, schemes of work which are available on websites, which can be helpful as a kind of overview of the whole course content. The learner guides and sample candidate response booklets as well that are available online. So there's collections of past students' answers to different exam questions, which can be really helpful as a guide. Using those past paper resources, which are a lot of them are available on board websites and file sharing websites. Completing lots of past papers, which helps to build confidence and hone your knowledge and your exam technique. And identify those weak areas and really, tackle them, confront them. Don't sort of avoid them or try to dodge them. Just go for it and just address it head on. Using those mark schemes is a really invaluable resource to help you grade papers and hone in on things that need work. Thinking about your exam strategy and your time management, so how you approach the questions, in what order, and so on. Checking the mark allocation and the weighting, thinking about the time you devote to those low-hanging fruit questions which carry 1 mark each versus the higher scoring questions, and how you plan those longer responses. We talked also about the importance of decoding exam questions and understanding command words and matching your response to what the examiners are looking for. And helpful to that is reading those examiner reports as well as the mark schemes to identify those pitfalls, the do's and don'ts as I look at it, and typical kind of mistakes or errors that students make, and therefore how to avoid them yourself. And also just finally to say, be aware of how the grade boundaries are not consistent across all subjects and all boards. They will vary. So check your particular specification so that you know what you're aiming for and what you need to get. And that can build a lot of confidence as well, because a family friend of ours, the daughter who was doing chemistry, she was a perfectionist, and she thought she wasn't doing very well on the chemistry past papers that she looked at before she looked at the boundaries. Then she realized she was scoring consistently top grades, but because she hadn't realized that, she'd assumed it was higher than it actually was, the grade boundary for the top grades. So being aware of that can be very helpful. And that sort of brings me to the end of, like, kind of wraps up what I was going to cover with you. And I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, but hopefully it's really helpful. I hope it's helpful to families out there, because a lot of this is based on our insights that we've sort of developed as a family through experience over many years. And I think it's so important to share those insights, because it can help others avoid certain, kind of mistakes or certain kind of ways of thinking which might be less than helpful. or certainly identify more positive things, well, approaches that worked for us and positive things that we felt were helpful in the process.
Yeah, and I think when you home educate, sometimes you can feel a little bit isolated when you're approaching exams because you don't have that teacher input and maybe your child is self-studying. And I think as much as we can share this kind of experience and this kind of information with each other, it just empowers us, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it? It's definitely, that's the key word, empowerment, because I think a lot of it is down to us doubting our own ability, students doubting their own ability, and as parents, as home educating parents in particular, doubting our own ability to facilitate our young people's journeys and allowing them to access opportunities. So much of it is, especially because, quite often we might face challenges in our environments, from people who are doubters about that. So we feel that pressure all the more. But knowing it can be done is hugely reassuring, I think, and knowing that a lot of people, it's a well-trodden path, and it's not as daunting. I think if there was one piece of advice I'd give to my younger self before we started the exam process, is not to worry so much about it. And just yeah, it can be done, and to focus on the process and how to achieve the outcomes you're looking for is really important, and quite, as you say, empowering then.
Well, thank you so much, Iram. And Iram, you run a couple of very helpful Facebook groups as well, don't you? So do tell our listeners where they can find you on Facebook as a tutor, but also the Facebook groups that you run for home educators.
Yeah, so I run two Facebook groups for home educating families. The first one was really born out of a desire to share our experiences about the exams journey. So that's a Facebook group called Home Education Exams Information and Advice. And all home educating families are welcome to join. And in that group, I've shared webinars, recordings of webinars that I've held about the exam process, shared our experiences, addressed sort of FAQs, if you like, a lot of commonly asked questions. And just, the purpose of it really was, initially, it was just myself, and I roped in a couple of home ed families, home ed moms that I had known for a long time, to talk about our experiences, because there is a wealth of information out there, but sometimes navigating that can be daunting in itself and overwhelming. And it's not the same as actually talking to somebody or listening to somebody talk about their experiences, which is, it's grown to about 1,500 people now. It started off with just me holding this webinar, and then I recorded it and shared that in the group. And then off the back of that, I've covered other topics relating to studying English and um, all different aspects of exams, and I hold webinars there from time to time, just so people have the opportunity to ask me questions. And then I also run an English IGCSE support group, an advice group, which is focused particularly on the Cambridge IGCSE specification, which is the one I teach and have a really thorough knowledge of. So I do sort of exam tips there, webinars, information and advice about all the courses I run, including I do an exam preparation course and various courses at IGCSE, and an interactive video course for students studying the syllabus, and they can study that independently or with tutor marked assignments. So all the information there is on my Facebook group, and everybody's welcome to join.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I know that you helped me very much when my daughter was doing the Cambridge English language exam, and I find your Facebook exam group so friendly and welcoming. And no matter what the question asked, there's always yourself and other members that pop up with really helpful answers. It's not the case. Sometimes you're on Facebook groups and the same question gets asked a lot, and you tend to get you don't realize that, and you tend to get quite short answers. But with your Facebook group, it's always a very loving response, I think, which is really nice in the home ed world. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. This is your third time with us. I feel like it's a hat trick, right?
So.
You should get something.
Do I get a prize?
You should get a t-shirt or something.
Oh, no, it's lovely to chat to you as ever. And yeah, I just hope that this podcast is able to help people and support them through that process, which I think can be, daunting for a lot of people. But yeah, have faith and be reassured and empowered to go for it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Iram. It's lovely having you on the show today.
Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.